You've been told he died a hero, sword raised, hand on the cannon, a noble soldier falling at the moment of his greatest glory. But that is a lie carefully painted over a slaughterhouse. What really happened to Louis Armistead in those final 48 hours is so brutal, so medically horrifying, that the history books simply chose to erase it. This is the uncensored truth. The man before the myth. Louis Addison Armistead was not born to be a martyr. He was born in 1817 into a proud Virginia military family, a dynasty that had bled for America in every war since the Revolution. His father, a general. His uncles, soldiers. War was not just a profession for the Armisteads. It was blood identity. West Point was where Louis was supposed to forge his legacy. But fate, and a ceramic plate, changed that. In 1836, during a dining hall altercation, Armistead reportedly smashed a plate over the head of a fellow cadet named Jubal Early, the same Jubal Early who would later become a notorious Confederate general. Armistead was dismissed. It was a humiliation that quietly haunted him for decades. Yet the army was not finished with him. He received a commission by appointment, bypassing the academy entirely, and by the time the Mexican-American War erupted in 1846, Louis Armistead had proven himself on the battlefield, not in a classroom. He was wounded twice at Chapultepec. He bled for the United States flag before he ever considered firing against it. The friendships forged in those years would become the emotional spine of his story. Among his closest companions was a broad-shouldered, barrel-chested officer named Winfield Scott Hancock, a Union man from Pennsylvania, a Democrat, and one of the most naturally gifted military commanders in American history. The two men drank together. They sang together. Their wives knew each other by name. When the Civil War tore the continent in half, it tore these men apart with surgical cruelty. In 1861, at a farewell gathering in California before officers departed for their respective sides, Armistead, already weeping, placed his hands on Hancock's shoulders and said, "Hancock, goodbye. You can never know what this has cost me." He then pressed a small prayer book into the hands of Hancock's wife, Almira, with the words, "Tell Winfield I will meet him either at heaven or on the field of battle." Neither man knew how literal that promise would become. The road to Gettysburg. By the summer of 1863, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia was riding the crest of what seemed like unstoppable momentum. General Robert E. Lee had just crushed the Union Army at Chancellorsville in May, arguably his tactical masterpiece. But it had cost him Stonewall Jackson, his irreplaceable right arm, dead from friendly fire. Lee's grand strategic gambit was now to carry the war north into Pennsylvania. A decisive Confederate victory on Union soil could force a peace settlement, gain European recognition, and end the war on Southern terms. Louis Armistead commanded a brigade within George Pickett's division, 3 Virginia brigades under a man famous for his perfumed hair, his long ringlets, and his reckless personal courage. Pickett's division had been held in reserve at Chancellorsville and arrived at Gettysburg relatively fresh, which is precisely why Lee chose it to lead the centerpiece assault on the third day. The plan was straightforward in theory and catastrophic in practice. After a massive artillery bombardment to silence Union guns, approximately 12,500 Confederate soldiers would march nearly a mile across open farmland, under fire the entire time, to strike the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. George Pickett's 3 brigades would form the tip of the spear. And within that tip, Armistead's brigade, roughly 1,900 men, would drive the hardest and deepest into the Union position. On the night of July 2nd, Armistead gathered his officers around a small fire. He was 51 years old, his beard streaked with gray, his eyes carrying the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from just 3 days of marching. He knew what the next morning meant. He said very little. Those present later recalled that he seemed to be a man already somewhere else. The artillery duel, a sensory nightmare. July 3, 1863. 1 p.m. What happened next was not a battle. It was physics applied to human flesh at industrial scale. 163 Confederate cannons opened fire simultaneously along a 2-mile front. The sound was reported by witnesses as far away as Pittsburgh, over 150 miles north. The earth itself seemed to convulse. Trees were shredded. Stone walls exploded into shrapnel. Horses vaporized. Men who survived it described being unable to hear for days afterward. The Union responded with their own artillery, 80 guns firing in counter-battery salvos. For nearly 2 hours, the two armies traded approximately 24,000 artillery rounds across a mile of Pennsylvania farmland. The smoke became so thick that Confederate gunners could no longer see their targets clearly. And crucially, Union Chief of Artillery Henry Hunt made a calculated decision to silence his guns partway through, to conserve ammunition and allow barrels to cool. The Confederate commanders read the silence as success. Their bombardment, they believed, had neutralized the Union guns. It had not. Hunt had played them perfectly. At approximately 3 p.m., Confederate General James Longstreet, who openly opposed the entire plan and had argued against it to Lee's face, gave the signal with what a staff officer described as the most reluctant gesture I ever witnessed from a commanding general. He simply nodded. He could not bring himself to speak the order. 12,500 men stepped out of the tree line. Pickett's charge, the mechanical slaughter. What the textbooks show you is a painting. Neat lines of gray uniformed soldiers advancing in disciplined formation across sunlit fields. Flags waving. A kind of terrible beauty. What actually happened was different in every measurable way. The moment the Confederate formations cleared the tree line and became visible to Union forces, the guns that Hunt had held in reserve opened up with a sound described by survivors as a physical force, as if the air itself had been weaponized. Rifled artillery at long range began tearing gaps in Confederate ranks from over 1,000 yards away. Men did not fall, they ceased to exist. Solid shot traveling at supersonic velocities did not wound the men it struck. It erased them. And still, impossibly, the lines kept moving. The Confederate formations closed their gaps and continued forward. Officers on horseback rode behind them, shouting encouragement, slashing with their swords at men who wavered. The discipline required to walk forward into that was something that defies modern civilian comprehension. As the ranges shortened, the nature of the killing changed. Canister shot, essentially enormous shotgun shells packed with iron balls, replaced solid shot. At 400 yards, it was brutally effective. At 200 yards, batteries switched to double canister, 2 rounds loaded simultaneously, doubling the density of iron balls per shot. At 100 yards, it was no longer warfare. It was industrial processing. The Confederate formations hit the Union line at what history calls the angle, a jog in a stone wall near a small copse of trees that would become the most significant piece of farmland in American military history. Here, in a space roughly the size of a city block, approximately 6,000 men were simultaneously trying to kill each other with rifles, bayonets, clubbed muskets, rocks, and bare hands. This is where Lewis Armistead made his charge into immortality, and directly into a death sentence. The breach, the high water mark. Armistead was one of fewer than 200 Confederate soldiers who actually made it over that stone wall alive. He placed his hat on the tip of his sword, not for theatrics, but so his men could see him through the smoke, to follow him, and went over the wall. He ran. He covered approximately 70 yards of open ground on the Union side of the wall, more ground than almost any other Confederate officer that day. He reached a Union artillery piece, one of the 3rd Battery, 1st New York Artillery. He put his hand on the barrel. In that single gesture, the Confederacy reached its farthest point north. Historians would later call this moment the high water mark of the Confederacy, the peak, the apex, the moment before the irreversible receding tide. He was surrounded. Union soldiers of the 72nd Pennsylvania and 69th Pennsylvania converged from 3 directions simultaneously. Armistead was hit, the exact details remain disputed, but he received at least 1 bullet wound and likely 2. Some accounts say he was struck in the arm. Others say the chest. The chaos of the moment meant that even men standing nearby could not agree on what they had witnessed. He went down. Around him, the Confederate breakthrough, never more than 200 men in a space that needed 2,000, collapsed in seconds. The men who had crossed the wall were overwhelmed, captured, or killed. The rest were already streaming back across the field, back toward the Confederate tree line, back across that mile of open ground under relentless Union fire. Pickett's charge had lasted less than 1 hour from first step to final collapse. George Pickett never forgave Lee for ordering it. The capture, almost murdered on the spot. What happened in the next 60 seconds after Armistead fell was not recorded in any official report. It survived only in the personal letters of Captain Henry Harrison Bingham, aide-de-camp to General Winfield Scott Hancock. Armistead was not immediately recognized as a general. He was a bleeding Confederate officer in the middle of what had just been a mass-killing ground, surrounded by Union soldiers who were still in the grip of combat adrenaline, still screaming, still stabbing men around them. The normal fate of a wounded Confederate officer in those conditions, particularly one who had just breached the Union line and put his hand on a Union cannon, was a bayonet through the chest. What stopped it was a gesture. Armistead, through blood and shock, apparently raised his hand in what those who recognized it understood immediately as a Masonic distress signal, a specific hand position combined with a whispered verbal code that Freemasons in the 19th century were expected to recognize and respond to across all lines of conflict. Captain Henry Bingham was a Freemason. Bingham pushed through the mob of soldiers surrounding the downed Confederate general, identified himself, and invoked the Masonic Compact: a brother was not to be harmed while giving the distress call. The soldiers, many of them confused and still blood-frenzied, stepped back. Bingham knelt beside Armistead. What happened next is one of the most documented intimate moments of the entire Civil War. Armistead reached into his coat and removed a small packet, his personal effects. He asked Bingham to deliver them to General Hancock. Among the items, described in accounts as a watch and personal keepsakes, was a message: "Tell Hancock I have done him and my country a great injustice which I shall always regret." Then Armistead was carried off the field. What came next was worse than the bullet. The Spangler Farm, a slaughterhouse with a name. The 11 Corps Field Hospital at the George Spangler Farm was not a hospital in any modern sense of that word. It was a triage factory operating at the absolute physical and psychological limit of 19th century medicine, staffed by exhausted surgeons who had been operating continuously since July 1st, 2 full days before Armistead arrived, and who were now surrounded by approximately 1,600 wounded men, with more arriving every hour. The surgeons worked without adequate anesthesia. They worked without sterile instruments. The same bone saw that amputated one leg was rinsed in a bucket of increasingly red water and applied to the next. The germ theory of disease would not be widely accepted for another decade. These men, educated, well-intentioned, doing their absolute best, had no idea that their unwashed hands were injecting death directly into every wound they treated. Armistead was carried into this environment as a Confederate general, which earned him slightly better accommodations, meaning he was placed inside a tent rather than left in the open, but the fundamental medical reality was identical for everyone. He had lost significant blood. He was in shock. He had been wounded at least once in the upper body. And now, in the Pennsylvania summer heat, his wounds were beginning the process that 19th century surgeons called laudable pus, which they mistakenly believed signified healing, but which modern medicine recognizes as the early stage of lethal infection. The farm itself was a sensory horror. Contemporary accounts describe the ground around the operating tables as soaked through with blood, turning to a dark paste in the summer heat. The sounds, continuous, unrelenting, were described by nurses and chaplains as something that could not be prepared for by any prior human experience. The smell was worse. Louis Armistead lay in this place for 2 days. The men who treated him were not cruel. They were not incompetent by the standards of their time. They were simply operating in conditions where survival from serious wounds was more a matter of chance than medicine. The tools available to them, morphine, chloroform, alcohol, and rudimentary bandaging, could slow death. They could not reliably prevent it. The infection, the real killer. What killed Louis Armistead was not the bullets. The bullets were merely the beginning of a process that the medicine of 1863 could not interrupt. The wound or wounds he received on the afternoon of July 3rd would have introduced battlefield contamination, dirt, fabric fibers, residue from the black powder that propelled the bullets, directly into his body. In the absence of any understanding of antisepsis, these wounds were cleaned in the conventional manner of the day, rinsing with water, probing with unwashed metal instruments, and bandaging with cloth that had not been sterilized. Within 12 to 18 hours, infection would have begun. The specific mechanism, whether streptococcal infection, septicemia, or the early stages of gangrene, is not recorded with clinical precision in surviving accounts. What is recorded is the progression. Armistead developed fever. The fever worsened. He became delirious. He drifted in and out of consciousness with the kind of terrible rhythm that Civil War medical personnel recognized as the final pattern. In his lucid moments, he apparently spoke of Hancock. He asked if his message had been delivered. He asked about the outcome of the charge. The answers, that the charge had failed, that thousands of his men were dead or captured, that Lee's army was already retreating south, may or may not have been given to him honestly. On the morning of July 5, 1863, less than 48 hours after he had put his hand on that cannon, Louis Armistead died. He was 51 years old. He died not on a battlefield, not in a moment of glory, but on a cot in a borrowed tent, on a Pennsylvania farmer's property, surrounded by the screaming wounded of the army he had spent his life fighting against. Winfield Scott Hancock, meanwhile, had also been wounded on July 3rd, a severe wound to the thigh that would trouble him for the rest of his life. He received Armistead's personal effects from Bingham. He wept. He kept the items for the remainder of his life. The two men never met again after that farewell in California. They kept their promise, they met on the field of battle. One standing, one dying. The mythology machine, how the truth was buried. Within years of the battle, the machinery of historical nostalgia had already begun transforming Gettysburg into something more palatable than what it actually was. The Lost Cause movement, a Confederate revisionist framework that recast the Civil War as a noble struggle between gentlemen rather than a violent defense of slavery, needed Gettysburg to be tragic, romantic, and glorious. Pickett's charge, in this framing, became not a military catastrophe born of poor tactical judgment but a doomed, gallant last stand. The Confederacy had not failed because its cause was wrong. It had failed because it was simply overwhelmed by Northern industry in numbers, and yet it had fought with matchless courage to the last. Armistead became the perfect symbol for this mythology. His friendship with Hancock. The Masonic death scene. The personal effects passed across enemy lines. These were real events, but they were selected, elevated, polished, and placed in the frame while the amputated legs at Spangler Farm, the infected wounds, the screaming in the dark, were quietly omitted. The 1993 film Gettysburg, technically well-crafted and sincerely meant, nonetheless delivered to mainstream audiences precisely the romantic version of events. The noble Armistead, glowing in cinematic tragedy, dying with dignity and meaning. That version feels better. It is designed to. The reality was a farm that smelled like an abattoir, a general lying on stained straw, a doctor probing an infected wound with an unwashed metal instrument, and a slow fever consuming a man who had made a catastrophic decision to walk into a point-blank artillery barrage in service of a cause that history would judge harshly. Both things can be acknowledged simultaneously. The courage was real. The friendship was real. The tragedy was real. But the full truth, the mechanically, medically, and sensory complete truth, is more horrifying, more human, and ultimately more honest than any painting of it has ever managed to be. What Gettysburg actually cost. The raw arithmetic of Pickett's charge is staggering even after 160 years. Of the approximately 12,500 men who stepped out of the tree line on July 3, somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 became casualties in under an hour. The 3 brigades of Pickett's own division, the men who made it farthest, were effectively destroyed as fighting units. Pickett himself never commanded in another major battle. His division was so shattered that when Lee asked him to rally his men for a possible counterattack later that afternoon, Pickett replied, "General Lee, I have no division." The casualty rate among Confederate officers was even more disproportionate, because officers led from the front. Of the brigade commanders who participated in the charge, every single one was either killed or wounded. The colonels commanding regiments fared similarly. Gettysburg as a whole, all 3 days, killed, wounded, or captured approximately 51,000 men from both sides combined. It remains to this day the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil and the bloodiest 3-day engagement in the entire history of the Western Hemisphere. The soldiers who survived, from both sides, carried what we would now diagnose as severe PTSD for the remainder of their lives. Many never spoke of what they had seen. The ones who did speak described details that contemporary newspaper editors declined to print as too disturbing for civilian readers. This is the context in which Louis Armistead died. Not in a painting. In a specific historical nightmare that consumed tens of thousands of real human beings in the Pennsylvania summer heat, over 3 days in July, for reasons that historians argue about to this day. The Watch, the Wall, and the Truth. There is a monument at Gettysburg today, precisely at the angle, marking the spot where Armistead fell. Tourists photograph it. Some weep. It is a genuinely moving sight. But stand there long enough and look around. The field is manicured now. The copse of trees is preserved. The stone wall has been rebuilt and maintained. It looks like a park, which is, of course, exactly what it is. Try instead to see it as it was, the ground soaked through with blood from thousands of bodies. The air choked with smoke so thick that the sun was blocked. The sound, which no modern audio system can truly recreate, of approximately 6,000 men simultaneously screaming, firing, dying, and being destroyed by artillery within a space you could walk across in 10 minutes. Then walk to where the Spangler Farm once stood, the 11 Corps Field Hospital site, and understand that this is where Louis Armistead actually died. Not at the wall. Not in a moment of dramatic glory. But 2 days later, slowly, from an infected wound, in a tent, on a farm, while the man who had been his closest friend lay wounded in his own hospital bed a mile away. The history books gave him a death befitting a painting. The truth gave him something far more human, and far more terrible. That is the real story of Gettysburg. Not the painting. Not the film. The farm. The fever. The 48 hours that history chose to erase.